This is the history of now. On April 18, 2015, residents of Baltimore, Maryland gathered in front of the Western District Police Station to protest police treatment of 25-year-old African-American resident Freddie Gray, who had sustained injuries during his arrest serious enough to put him in a coma. The following day, Gray died, and the protest expanded when this became public knowledge. Over the next several weeks, the national media reported on the ferment in Baltimore, which included spontaneous demonstrations against police brutality, as well as civil unrest and rioting. During the period, a state of emergency was declared in the city, thousands of police and National Guard were deployed, and at least 250 people were arrested, with 20 officers injured. The media attention spotlighted a number of issues that deserve research into the history of now. The death of Freddie Gray and the public's response followed a series of high-profile incidents involving police actions that led to the injury or death of African Americans in particular, a trend that should be scrutinized historically. Similarly, the American public seemed surprised to discover the militarization of the police that had taken place steadily over the past several decades, linked to the national security state and the surplus of military hardware, and this also has a history behind it. But for this segment of the history of now, we're going to focus on one of the most commented upon aspects of the events in Baltimore, the enormous racial disparity in economic conditions in American urban centers, and in particular, the disparity in housing and its relationship to race. Now, in Baltimore, 148,000 people, a disproportionate number of them African American, live below the poverty line. That is 28.3% of the population of the city. And Baltimore is but one example of the inequality of housing conditions all throughout the country. You could expand this to include Chicago, St. Louis, Atlanta, Detroit, Philadelphia, New York, and on and on. African Americans make up 15% of the U.S. population, but they are 48% of public housing residents. Similarly, African American family incomes are 60% those of white Americans, so there's a disparity in income. But the disparity in home ownership is much more dramatic. In that case, the figure is African American home equity is 5% of whites. On the other hand, Baltimore contains areas of such wealth that the Business Journal recently ranked its Towson metropolitan area as the 18th most affluent of the nation's 942 metropolitan areas. So this appears to me to be an excellent point for historical intervention in our regular segment, The History of Now. And the question for today, for this segment, is why is there such a large racial disparity in household wealth? Now, it may surprise you to learn that this concentration of household wealth in places like Baltimore can be traced back in part to the New Deal and the ways in which welfare reforms were complicated by the politics of race. Last week we were discussing the New Deal's response to the Great Depression, and we talked about the array of programs designed to combat unemployment, homelessness, and the economic dislocation that came with the Depression. The New Deal had a slogan of the 3 R's that stood for relief, recovery, and reform. Now, reform in particular was partially aimed at the enormous economic inequality of the 1920s, which many held to be responsible for the stock market burst. Through a dizzying array of programs and agencies, the New Deal sought to curb some of the destabilization believed to have been caused by the economic inequality by institutionalizing the modern welfare state, creating a safety net to help in times of economic destabilization. And the New Deal seems to have had, there's at least a correlation between the Depression and the New Deal and a period in which economic inequality was at a low in the United States. So you see in this chart, this is a chart of economic inequality with the highest spikes of inequality in the 1920s and then later on in the 2000s. The period from the Depression through the New Deal through the 40s, 50s, 60s, and into the 70s is a period of low economic inequality in the United States. One of the areas that the New Deal targeted for reform was housing policy. In his second inaugural address in 1937, Franklin Roosevelt expressed his frustration at seeing, quote, 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, and ill-nourished. And despite a flurry of activity and programs in his first term, it was clear that there was still a lot of work to be done to promote recovery and reform of the United States economy. 12.5 million workers were still unemployed, 9,000 banks were closed, new home construction had dropped 95% below the 1920s rate. So you had cities like Chicago and Baltimore that were mired in housing crises, exacerbated by the movement of families into urban centers in search of work during the Great Depression. And housing was among the key problems that the New Deal sought to address through a number of means. First, private development and programs for homeowners, like the Homeowners Loan Corporation. This is to stimulate new home construction, because new home construction had plummeted so far below the 1920s figures. And the Federal Housing Administration, also designed to help supply low-cost loans to homeowners to build their own houses. And this helps to expand the suburbs during the period of during the Depression. Similarly, there was the United States Housing Authority was created, or the USHA. This was aimed at affordable housing for the working poor. So the first two were primarily aimed at the suffering middle class and upper middle class. The 1937 U.S. Housing Authority was aimed at affordable housing for the working poor. Earlier, the Public Works Administration, or the WPA, created and directed housing developments. But in 1937, under the Wagner-Steagall Housing Act, the policy shifted. Federally guaranteed loans and grants to build low-income housing was an unprecedented example of the expansion of the welfare state, and it was an evolution of progressive ideas, and reformers were really optimistic, as you can see from some of these brochures, that they were going to eliminate slums from the United States. Okay, so there's an issue here, though. And the issue is that federal government maintained a policy of racial segregation in public housing nationwide. This was true in northeastern cities like New York and border cities like Baltimore and St. Louis. Federal housing policy thus reinforced private policy. So in 1925, in Baltimore, 18 Baltimore neighborhood associations came together to form the Allied Civic and Protective Association for the purpose of urging both new and existing property owners to sign restrictive covenants. Restriction covenants are agreements between neighborhood associations committing them to never sell to African Americans. So this is before the Great Depression. This is in 1925. Neighborhood associations coming together to agree to commit themselves to never sell to Black Americans. Then such covenants were often city-sponsored. So first you have it as neighborhood associations, then they get some government sponsorship on the municipal level. Furthermore, though, the FHA during the New Deal explicitly barred subdivision developers from qualifying for federal subsidies unless they also committed to excluding African Americans. So now you have a New Deal policy on the federal level encoding racial segregation into its policies. The FHA also barred Black people from obtaining bank mortgages for suburban divisions and refused to insure mortgages in Black neighborhoods through a process that came to be called redlining. That is, drawing up maps of cities and color-coding areas that were considered to be poor credit risks. From the Federal Housing Authority's own underwriting manual, we have the following quote: red areas, and you can see this in this map right here, red areas are characterized by detrimental influences in a pronounced degree, undesirable population, or infiltration of it. Some mortgage lenders may refuse to make loans in these neighborhoods, and others will lend only on a conservative basis. This map right here is a map drawn up by the Federal Housing Authority, showing you in color-coded areas desirable neighborhoods versus undesirable neighborhoods. And this is the street map of the Baltimore area. I believe this map is from 1937. It wasn't just Baltimore. So we can see this is the map of Philadelphia. Red areas color-coded as undesirable areas. Incidentally, a big portion of that red area right there is where I grew up in Philly. Here is Brooklyn with its areas color-coded. Red-lined areas considered to be undesirable populations. St. Louis, San Francisco, Oakland, etc. Unable to get mortgages and restricted by policy to overcrowded neighborhoods where housing supply was short, African Americans either rented apartments at considerably higher rates or bought homes on installment plans and called contract sales at much higher interest rates and with substantially less security of accumulated equity. What this meant was that investment in real estate was essentially impossible in most of the places where, due to explicit policies of racial segregation, African Americans lived. This is the essence of ghettoization. It's a deliberate policy of segregated neighborhoods, and home equity is one aspect of the massive disparity in economic income inequality. Here's a map of just some of the cities that I just pointed out. I'm putting this map up to illustrate that this was a nationwide phenomenon. This is racial segregation nationwide, not restricted to the South. In Baltimore and elsewhere, the distressed condition of African American working and lower middle class families can be largely attributable to the history of federal policy that prohibited black families from accumulating housing equity during the suburban boom that moved white families into single-family homes from the mid-1930s to the mid-1960s, thus being able to leave to their children wealth that they had accumulated in a way that African Americans could not. So again, back to this question, why is there such a large racial disparity in household wealth? It's at least partially attributable to deliberate federal policy. One of the consequences is now there is a 20-year difference in life expectancy between those who live in Baltimore's most affluent neighborhood and those who live 6 miles away in its most impoverished. So here is a map of where the percentage of residents who are black in the Baltimore area on the left, and then the percentage of population that is unemployed looking for work. You also see these are some of the key areas of protests in Baltimore in April 2015. And if you were to take this map and go all the way back to the 1930s and look at redlining, it lines up perfectly. This neighborhood has been in a depressed economic condition for, going on 80 years or more. So, as this history of now has suggested, the institutionalization of the welfare state during the New Deal had far-reaching but contradictory implications for the history of the United States. Like many aspects of American life, the concept of welfare has been complicated by the politics of race and class, with racial demographics and economics all intertwined. So here's 2 questions for you. What is the legacy of the New Deal today? Where do you see the politics of welfare in action? So just like the example I just gave you of some policy going back to the New Deal, still visible in Baltimore, in Baltimore housing, the question for you is to go see, where do you see the legacy of the New Deal? So go find a story in the news about any aspect of welfare in American society. Do a little research on its history. Write a little 1 to 2 page analysis of your findings. Upload that to Dropbox by 9 a.m. next Wednesday, July 29th. Get yourself up to 40 participation points. And if you want just a few little clues about what to think about when you think about the concept of the welfare state, here are just 4 examples, and there are many more you could think of. Unemployment compensation. That's an aspect of the welfare state. Social Security. Key aspect of the welfare state. Healthcare. Labor regulation. And there's many, many more. So I'm really interested and excited to see what you find. Write that, get it up to Dropbox by next Wednesday. It's the day before the last class. Post a little comment about it in the discussion boards. Get yourself a whole bunch of points to wrap up the summer.